Welcome to the HTH Church podcast. We are a church in the heart of Hastings whose desire is to build communities of people who are so passionate about being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and joining in with what Jesus is doing, that lives, families, and communities are changed and transformed one at a time. On this podcast, you can keep up to date with the latest talks from our Sunday services, as well as additional bonus episodes which include conversations, interviews, devotions, and much more. If you'd like to find out more about the church, you can visit our website, hthchurch.org. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy this episode.
Happy New Year. I haven't spoke to you since this year, so it's really great to be with you. This is a little dream come true for me because I've been nagging for a while to speak at the Women on the Well, so now I'm just hoping I don't completely faceplant doing it. So I'm going to read not the whole story. This is probably a story that's quite familiar to many of you. It's a very long story, so I'm just going to read some of it, and then we'll pick some of it out. This is going to be quite an old school Bible study today, so hold on tight, okay? But hopefully we can do this together. So, Jesus 4, and I'm going to start from verse 4. Okay. Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground of Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, and so did his sons and his flocks and herds?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water, welling up into eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you have 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet." Now, there is so much going on in this text that if I could, I would lock the doors of this building and keep you here for a day. But I'm not allowed to do that. So what I'm hoping to do is at least just open your eyes to some of the significance and beauty of this famous story. For some of you that have heard me speak before, you've probably seen a bit of a pattern with me, which is often I jump out of the story and I go back to the Old Testament. And I'm going to be doing that quite a lot today because we can get a lot from this story, reading it off the page. It's really beautiful as it is. But if we look at some of the layers of meaning that lead up to this story, it's like seeing the whole thing in 3D, and we see things that we may have missed in the text. So I'm going to take you down a few rabbit holes of things that happened before this story, and I'm going to go back to the Old Testament. And the first rabbit hole we're going to go down together is the rabbit hole of the location of where this story happened, because it is hugely significant. So we know it's Samaria and a town called Sychar. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And we know it was at Jacob's well. All of these things are massively significant. Now, in the Old Testament, this town was called Sychar. And in the Old Testament, this town was mentioned 59 times, okay? It had huge historical significance for the people of Israel, and not all of it was good. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go through all 59 times with you this morning, but I am just going to pick out a couple because I think when we understand how significant this place is, it gives such a deep meaning to the text. So we're going to go back to this town and look at some key things that happened in the Old Testament. The first thing that happened, an amazing thing that happened, is Shechem was the place where Abraham had a physical encounter with the living God. And as Abraham encountered God, God promised Abraham land. He made a covenant promise, is what we call it in the Bible, a promise between man and God. And after Abraham had this amazing encounter with the living God, after he'd had this promise over his life and the generations to follow, the first thing he did was create an altar and worship God. So the first time we see this physical place in the Bible is a place of connecting with God, engaging with him, encountering him, worshipping him. It's a place of beauty. And yet, as we often see in the stories of the Old Testament, within a generation, things have really unraveled. And Shem becomes a place where utter depravity and evil takes place. In fact, just to really layer it, a man called Shem from Shechem attacked and violated Jacob's daughter, Dinah. This was an awful tragedy. It's something that we don't often talk about on Sundays. I'm not going to go deeply into it now. But this woman was just completely violated. And Jacob, her father's response, it says in the text, was to be quiet about it. And what we hear is from theologians and commentators, the idea is that Dinah no longer has any economic value to him because she is not pure anymore. And he doesn't want to draw attention to this. So instead of being angry or wanting justice for his daughter, he's very quiet. But Jacob's sons were absolutely furious about what happened to their sister. And they were so furious that they avenged her in this place by slaughtering every single man in the city. Sorry, this is quite dark. This is jumping into the Old Testament. And when they had slaughtered, just to add insult to injury, it had just been before every man in the city had been circumcised. So I think that was a bit mean, that they were all circumcised, and a few days later they went in with mass slaughter. Don't think they had much of a chance. Shem is also the place where Jacob again sent Joseph to meet his brothers. That story, we unpacked that, I think, last year. We did a whole preaching sermon on it. But Jacob said to his son Joseph, go to Shechem, find your brothers. And we see the story where Joseph set off to Shechem, and his brothers had already gone and left. So he went through Shechem, found his brothers. And it's that scene, we see the awful scene where they brutally attack him. They throw him in a pit, what they call a cistern. They throw him in and leave him for dead. That cistern he was thrown in was a type of well. It was like a man-made well. Not a well that came from a spring of living water, but a man-made well to collect like rainwater. And Joseph was just thrown into this cistern. We see Joshua, who those that know your Bibles might know that he is an Old Testament, almost like a precursor to Jesus, like a Christ-like figure. He goes back and he takes his men back to Shechem and again renews the covenant of God in that place, where once there'd been encounter with God, but then there'd just been hatred, war, abandonment. But then before the Old Testament is over, we have this really kind of small scene that you could really miss in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a prophet in the Old Testament. And there's a big group of men that come from Shechem. And they go to this place. You can read about it. I'm not going to unpack it now. But they come from Shechem and they go to this town. And every one of them is brutally murdered and thrown into a cistern. Again, these deep man-made wells. When we approach this story in Jesus, we have left behind layer after layer after layer of rotten humanity from the Old Testament. We've seen some of the worst things that humanity can do to each other. And the story left at this location is a place of hatred, murder, and death. That's what this place represents. And it also represents people being abandoned, thrown into these cisterns, this man-made well full of death and decay. So we already, as Jesus walks into this place, it is loaded with meaning and significance. But there's another layer that as Jesus walks into this place in Samaria, at the time in history, Samaria, you might know the story of the Good Samaritan, was the complete enemy of the Jewish people. One theologian says this. He says that pious Jews travelled around Samaria to avoid what they thought was the defilement of going into this place. And geographically, it was a valley between two mountains. That meant that the Jewish people, save going through the valley, would rather go over a mountain or round a mountain just to avoid going into this place. It was an awful location, riddled with history. I don't know what we can think of like it, but maybe we could think of things like historic places, maybe when we had the Holocaust, or just places that we know represented just such awful things. And still, even now in history, they're known for those things. I don't see Hastings as being on that level, just to be clear. But I love Hastings. I grew up here. I come back here to raise my children. But when I was a teenager growing up in Hastings, there was a period of time where there just seemed to be such awful things going on in Hastings. There were murders. There were women abused. And there was just awful things happening. And I remember at the time, I don't know if any of you remember this, but the tabloid newspapers in England ran an article, and it said on the front page, "Hell on Sea." And they had this whole article about how awful Hastings was as a place. The great news is, we're going to follow this through this story, that the places that most people think are rubbish and worthless are just the kind of places that God is interested in moving in working in, and bringing transformation in. A couple of months ago for my work, many of you know I work for Tear Fund, which is an international development charity. I've mentioned this before while I was speaking just briefly, but a couple of months ago I was in northern Uganda in a place called Karamoja. That's been on our radar for the last few years because they've had severe water shortage and drought, which has had a knock-on effect on their crops, which has caused massive loss of life, effectively, because there's not enough food or water. And I went there apparently last year. I think I said this here. There was 75% crop failure last year. This year there was 55% crop failure. And I went with a group of leaders because there's some communities we are working in and some we're looking at working in. We went to see these communities. And I had a colleague as well that's done a lot more travelling than me, has seen a lot more than me. But he went and he said it was the worst thing he'd seen in terms of some of the poverty that we engage with globally. And I went to this community, and there were many child-led households because there were no parents. The parents had died because of the food shortage. There was households being run by 10-year-olds. Some of the children were eating leaves. Some of them were travelling like 5 kilometres for stagnant, dirty water. There was no toilets. There was open defecation. It really wasn't great. And there's this guy there called Paul who's lived there his whole life and now has a charity working to bring transformation in this region. And I was talking to him, it really did seem quite hopeless in some pockets. And he said to me this, he said, everybody thinks nothing good is ever going to come from Karamoja. He said, but Jesus said that about Nazareth. They said that about Nazareth, and Jesus came from Nazareth. And he says, so I'm living here, and I'm working here, and I'm committed to seeing the transformation that the kingdom is going to bring in here. When we come to this story, the location itself is absolutely loaded with historical significance. But also, so is the idea of a well, okay? But the well is loaded with significance for completely the opposite reasons. Not hatred, not death, but actually love, romance, and betrothal. I don't know if any of you like movies. I watch quite a lot as a treat with my kids. It's one of the things we all sit and do together. For a long time now, my kids have to check whether the movie is suitable for me. And sometimes I have to leave the room if it's too violent or scary, and they tell me when I can come back. I won't tell you what age that started happening with my kids, 'cause it's kind of embarrassing. I don't know if any of you any hands up who like a romance or a romantic comedy? Any favours? I've got a few across the room that favour those. Now, we know, don't we, what a romance is or what a romantic comedy. Now, I think Netflix has made this easy for us because they now have an actual section that says romantic comedy, so we just look underneath. But we would have known cultural markers. We might see two people on the front of the cover. We might listen to the movie and hear music. We might think of two people meeting in a romantic location. Me and my kids, often every year, we watch The Holiday at Christmas. And there's a bit in that movie where they talk, the old guy who used to be a movie producer talks about the meet cute. He talks about the charming and sweet place that two people meet. Something like Sleepless in Seattle, where they meet, don't they, up the Empire State Building. Well, the Bible is rich with genre, and it's rich with markers. And because we are a different culture, society, and time, we completely miss them. But the well, believe it or not, was a significant marker in the Old Testament for a place of meeting your partner. Women gathered at wells. So can you imagine loads of gorgeous women with their water buckets, coming with their friends, all to go to the well. It's kind of like, I don't know if it's the modern version of Tinder, or maybe that's not so romantic, I've no idea. But the well was a significant thing. Isaac met Rebekah through a well meeting. Jacob met Rachel through a well meeting. Moses met Zipporah through a well meeting. Some of these patriarchs of the Old Testament met their partner at a well. And the Israelites, probably a bit like us, they had key things they were looking for in a partner for themselves or often for their children. They were looking for the right family, the right tribe, good looking, status, sexually pure for the women, won't comment on the men. And just as an example, Rebekah, we know from the text, I'm going for that one because I like her name. Abraham sent his servant outside of Canaan to go to his father's sort of location to find a wife. So he didn't see his own tribe that was living within the Canaanites as the right tribe. So he traveled to go to a well in a different place. And Rebekah, she draws her water in the evening with all her friends, because they all come out in the evening, it's when they all do it. We're told she was beautiful. We're told she was a virgin. We know from the text that she had the right family. There's all these markers about where she lived and the names of the places. So she was tick, 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 tick in the perfect kind of wife. And she married Isaac. So when Jesus comes into this story, which is loaded with hatred and murder stories, and he approaches a well, the readers at the time, or the listeners, would have known that's indicative of betrothal, and the implication of the story is about marriage. Now, when Jesus approaches this location, we can see the fragility of it. In fact, the current location is in the West Bank, where we know there are currently fragilities. It's complex. There's been war. There's hatred. It is a very politically complex place. Well, that's right where Jesus pitched up at this well. He should not have been there. And when you layer it then on top with the markers of a wedding story, the listeners or the readers would have been going, what is this? Why would anybody want to choose a wife from this place, let alone Jesus? And the story continues. Again, I can't go through all of them, but almost every verse has got loaded markers. We're told in the beginning he goes at the 6th hour. We might miss that, but that means he went in the noonday sun. And at the time, the outcasts of society, the ones that weren't included, often the women who were outcasts or deemed as bad, impure women, they went at noonday sun because of shame, because they weren't included, because they couldn't be seen with the others. And Jesus goes to Jacob's well, which we've already looked at the threads of Jacob, and he sits there at noon waiting for someone to come. And then the Samaritan woman comes. She comes alone. She's not named. We don't know her family. If you think of how we've just looked at Rebekah, how she's this amazing, beautiful woman with right status, this Samaritan woman, the only thing we know about her is her race, which is the wrong one. She is outside of human connection and community. And as she comes up, Jesus approaches her and he asks her for water. And she replies, which we just read, didn't she? She says this, "You are a Jew. I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" A couple of theologians say things like this. Kenneth Bailey says this, "Jesus breaks the social taboo in talking to a woman And he ignores 500 years of hostility that has developed between the Jews and the Samaritan. He goes right bang in the middle of it. Elaine Storkey says this: if Jesus were to accept a drink from this woman, he would need to go through stringent purification rituals. It would have made him unclean. He'd have been religiously unclean. He'd have been outside his own community. He'd have had to go through probably months and months of purification rituals just to get back clean again. Yusuf Sadiq says this: Jesus was not ignorant of these social barriers. He just radically disregarded them, which I love about Jesus. You see, the first time Jesus revealed his identity as divine and the Son of God, it was to this Samaritan woman. He says this: if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you springs of living water. Now, this phrase would not have been lost on the Jews or the Samaritans there, because Jeremiah, the prophet, remember we left all those murdered people in the cistern. Jeremiah had a prophetic word, and the prophetic word was that people had forgotten God, the spring of living water, and they dug their own cisterns. So when Jesus comes into this place at this time and says, "Come to me and I will give you living water," he is tapping into a prophetic word where the people of God was expecting someone to come and that God would be the living water. Jesus was revealing his divinity. And not only was he revealing his divinity, he was also speaking into that issue of broken cisterns that represented man's efforts, independence, and death when they tried to create their own water sources. And if it wasn't enough for this woman to really know she was talking to someone profound, he adds this. He adds a word of knowledge, doesn't he? You have had 5 husbands, and the person you're with now is not your husband. And she just responds, I can see that you are a prophet. Jesus knows this woman's past, but he shows no judgment to her. He treats her with such dignity and care and love and respect and honor. And this is a betrothal story. For those of you that know your Old Testament, the imagery that God often uses when he speaks to Israel is that of a husband. He says in Isaiah, "For your maker is your husband." He's talking to Israel. In fact, in chapter 3 of this verse, John the Baptist has come preparing the way for Jesus. And one of the things John the Baptist is saying is the bride belongs to the bridegroom. John the Baptist is literally telling everyone the bridegroom is coming, the bridegroom is here. And so when Jesus approaches this woman, he comes as the 7th man. Again, that's hugely significant in the time because 7 meant complete, full, holy. 7 was like the holy number. And Jesus approaches this woman as the 7th man. And he comes not like Isaac and Jacob and Moses looking for this list of perfection in a wife. He comes to this woman who is an enemy, who is an outcast of her own people, who is rejected, who is impure. And it is to this woman he seeks to show who he is. Now I'm going to tell you a story, and I almost wish I wasn't telling you this. Because when I heard this story, it's literally traumatized me for about 15 years, and I'm now passing on the collective trauma, so I do apologize. This might be the last time I get let up here. A number of years ago, I was at a leadership conference, and I heard a guy, some of you may know him, he's called Simon Ponsby. I reckon if he can tell this story, then so can I. He told the story about himself, and funny enough, a couple of years ago, I bumped into him, and I told him how traumatized I'd been ever since he told this story, and he said that he gave me permission to share it with whoever I liked. So I have permission to share his story. Simon Ponsby was at this great big leadership conference with hundreds of leaders from all around the UK, and he got up and he said that they'd been sitting on the toilet that morning. I know. And as he was sitting on the toilet, I can't believe I'm telling this story, as he was sitting on the toilet, he was playing with his signet ring. This ring was really important. It was like a family heirloom that had gone down from generations to generations. It meant the world to him. He was fiddling with his ring, and as he was fiddling with his ring, it fell off his finger and landed in the toilet. It's gross, I know. And without a second thought, he reached down into the toilet, had a rummage around, and found his ring, and then cleaned it, I hope, with clean water. Gross image. I'm really sorry to share it with you. But you know what? In this story, Jesus, the Son of God, who'd come down from the heavens, who'd had the humility of coming as a child, came into Samaria with all of its dirt and baggage and evilness and hatred and murder. He put his hand into the cistern that had been like full of death and murder represented, and he said that he is the spring of life, that if you come to him, you will never go thirsty. It's like he reaches almost into that toilet bowl of humanity that is disgusting and dirty. You'd never want to go anywhere near it. That is what Jesus does to humanity. That's what Jesus does to Samaria. That's what Jesus does to this woman, and that is what Jesus does to us. He pulls us out of our shame, of our sin, of our mistakes, of our generations sometimes of things that have happened in our family. Jesus reaches down and he pulls us out and he cleans us because we are special to him, because he loves us, because he's not going to let go of us, because he's not going to flush us down the chain. He reaches down, and what does he do? He cleans us with his living water that cleans our soul, water that changes us. So what does this mean for us? This is good news for us. Jesus meets us in our most despised places. He meets us at our worst. He meets us at our grubbiest. He doesn't just meet us there. He comes to find us. He went and sat at that well waiting for that woman. He comes to find us. And God changes the narrative. So he changed the narrative of Shem. Shem, that was a place known for brokenness, failure of Jacob, overrun with evil, a woman defiled. Jesus meets another woman there. He redeems her. He shows her love and grace and forgiveness. He redeems the woman. The story goes on to say she leaves her pot behind. She didn't even get the water in the end. She runs to tell her community about Jesus. And theologians say she is the first evangelist of the New Testament. And he redeems us of our history, of our generational brokenness. He comes as a circuit breaker to bring you life, to bring you starts, to bring freedom, to bring forgiveness to the captives. All of our places we carry where they've gone wrong and bring shame, God comes to give us a new identity, that we are clean, that we are loved, that we are betrothed, that we are included, that we are forgiven, that we are free. And from those cisterns of broken water in the Old Testament, God transforms them and says that he is the well of living water and that we can come to him.
Thanks for tuning in to the HTH Church podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not share it with someone you think would appreciate it? And be sure to subscribe to our channel to get notified when new episodes are published. Thanks again for listening, and we hope you have a great day.